You think you know what made early humans afraid. Saber-toothed cats, cave bears, the cold that could kill in hours. But there's something else that made Neanderthal men freeze with terror. Something that walked upright, spoke softly, and looked almost exactly like them. Beautiful women. Not their women, the other kind. The ones with higher foreheads and smaller brows who appeared in Europe 45,000 years ago and changed everything. If you value documented prehistoric and archaeological history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Nature and the Journal of Human Evolution. Now back to the story. These weren't myths or legends. These were Homo sapiens women moving into Neanderthal territory across southern Europe. DNA evidence from sites like Vindija Cave in Croatia shows the encounters were real, intimate, and for Neanderthal males, more dangerous than any predator they'd ever faced. At Spy Cave in Belgium, archaeologists found something that tells the whole story. 2 Neanderthal skeletons dated to 36,000 years ago. Male. Both show signs of severe malnutrition in their final months. Their bones carry stress markers that match prolonged anxiety. But here's what makes it strange. The cave sits in rich hunting grounds, mammoth bones scattered everywhere. These men didn't starve because there was no food. They starved because they stopped hunting. The Neanderthal brain was bigger than ours. Their bodies were built for Ice Age survival. They'd lived in Europe for 300,000 years, mastering every challenge the continent could throw at them. But they had one fatal weakness. They'd evolved in small, isolated groups, 30 people max. Everyone knew everyone. Their social circuits couldn't handle strangers. Then came the sapiens women, taller, different facial structure, voices that hit frequencies Neanderthal ears had never processed. At sites like Peștera Q08 in Romania, we find mixed DNA, Neanderthal and sapiens genes combined. The attraction was real. The fear was stronger. Neanderthal males faced an impossible choice. These foreign women triggered every mating instinct they possessed, but approaching meant leaving the safety of their territorial boundaries. It meant competing with sapiens males who hunted in groups of 50 or more. It meant genetic betrayal of their own lineage. At Grotte du Renne in France, the archaeological layers tell a brutal story. 42,000 years ago, Neanderthal toolmaking suddenly becomes erratic. Obsidian sourced from 300 kilometers away, distances no Neanderthal group had ever traveled. They were following the sapiens' migrations, chasing what they couldn't have. The stress killed them, not violence, not climate change, chronic anxiety that shut down their immune systems. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, pollen analysis shows Neanderthal groups abandoned prime territory during the exact window when sapiens were passing through. They chose starvation over contact. The chemical evidence backs this up. Cortisol markers in Neanderthal teeth from Krapina. Cave in Croatia spike exactly during the contact period, 38,000 years ago. The hormone levels match what we see in modern humans experiencing severe PTSD. Their bodies were flooded with stress chemicals 24 hours a day. Month after month, year after year. Modern humans weren't just another species. They were the uncanny valley made flesh, close enough to trigger recognition, different enough to trigger revulsion. Neanderthal brains couldn't process the contradiction. Attraction and terror flooded their neural circuits simultaneously. At La Chapelle aux Saints in France, researchers found Neanderthal tools mixed with sapiens artifacts. The contact zones exist, but they're always brief, always abandoned. The Neanderthals couldn't sustain proximity to these women who looked like distorted reflections of their own females. The DNA tells the real story. Modern European populations carry 2 to 4% Neanderthal genes, but it's not random mixing. The genetic signatures cluster around specific time periods and locations, 40,000 to 35,000 years ago. Southern Spain, southern Italy, the places where Neanderthal populations made their last stands. These weren't willing encounters. They were desperate ones. Neanderthal groups fragmenting under psychological pressure, males breaking from their tribes to pursue sapiens women. Most never returned. The ones who did brought foreign genes and foreign diseases that finished what the anxiety had started. El Sidrón Cave in Spain holds the most disturbing evidence. 12 Neanderthal skeletons, all related, all killed and butchered by their own people. Carbon dating places the massacre at 49,000 years ago, right when sapiens first appeared in northern Spain. The cut marks on the bones tell a story of ritualistic dismemberment. The group ate their own dead, rather than let them breed with outsiders. But the chemical analysis of their teeth reveals the truth. 3 of the males had been gone for months before returning to the cave. Strontium isotopes in their dental enamel match deposits 200 kilometers south. They'd followed sapiens groups. When they came back, their own families killed them. The psychological warfare was invisible but lethal. Neanderthal females began rejecting their own males. At Mezhmyskaya Cave in Russia, genetic analysis shows something unprecedented. The last generation of Neanderthals there shows signs of inbreeding depression, population bottleneck. The females had stopped reproducing entirely, rather than mate with males who'd been exposed to sapiens women. Competition for resources wasn't the issue. At Abric Romani in Spain, researchers found evidence that Neanderthals and sapiens shared the same hunting grounds for over 2,000 years without direct conflict. The problem was attraction. The magnetic pull that made Neanderthal males abandon everything they'd evolved to protect. If you value documented prehistoric and archaeological history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. Now back to the story. The morphological differences were subtle but devastating. Sapiens women had longer legs, smaller jaws, more prominent cheekbones, features that triggered every mate selection instinct Neanderthals possessed, while simultaneously marking them as genetically foreign. The uncanny valley effect in its most primitive form. At Riparo Mezzana in Italy, archaeologists found Neanderthal jewelry dated to 44,000 years ago. Shell beads and colored pigments, never seen before in the archaeological record. They were trying to make themselves attractive to sapiens women, using techniques they'd observed from a distance. Mimicry born of desperation. The vocal differences were even more disruptive. Computer modeling of Neanderthal vocal tracts shows they couldn't produce the full range of sapiens speech sounds. When sapiens women spoke, it activated neural pathways in Neanderthal brains that had never fired before. The combination of familiar pitch with foreign phonemes created a neurological feedback loop. Addiction to sounds they couldn't replicate. Genetic analysis from Feldhofer Cave, the original Neanderthal type site, shows elevated levels of dopamine receptor variants. The brain chemistry of obsession. These weren't just casual encounters. Neanderthals were developing biochemical dependencies on sapiens contact. The territorial breakdown accelerated after 38,000 years ago. Cave sites across France show sudden abandonment patterns. Not gradual migration or seasonal movement, instant desertion. At Combe Capelle, researchers found cooking fires still smoldering when the site was buried by sediment. The occupants left mid-meal. Tool technology degraded rapidly during the contact period. At Châtel-Perronian sites like Grotte du Renne, Neanderthal lithics become increasingly crude and inefficient. Their cognitive resources were being hijacked by obsessive thoughts about sapiens women. They couldn't focus on survival tasks. The neurological evidence is definitive. Brain endocasts from late Neanderthal skulls show enlarged amygdala and reduced prefrontal cortex development, the same pattern seen in modern humans with severe anxiety disorders. They were literally rewiring their brains around fear and attraction. Blood protein analysis from Neanderthal bones at Vindija Cave reveals chronically elevated stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol levels that would be fatal in modern humans. They were living in permanent fight-or-flight mode. The beautiful women had turned their own biochemistry into a weapon. At Gibraltar's Gorham Cave, the final Neanderthal stronghold, excavations revealed something remarkable: hoarded sapiens artifacts. Stone tools and bone ornaments clearly made by modern humans, but carefully collected and hidden by Neanderthals. They were keeping relics of the women they couldn't approach. The cave paintings there aren't random marks. Recent analysis shows their crude attempts to reproduce sapiens' artistic styles observed from hiding places. The last Neanderthals spent their final years trying to understand the minds of the women who were destroying them. Population genetics reveals the final twist. The breeding events weren't mutual seduction. They were desperate gambles by isolated Neanderthal males who'd lost their tribal support systems. Genetic diversity in late Neanderthal populations crashes to near zero. They were breeding with anything that would accept them, including sapiens women who may have seen them as exotic curiosities. The archaeological record shows no evidence of sapiens' aggression toward Neanderthals, no mass graves, no weapons designed specifically for human versus human combat. The conquest was passive. They simply existed in the same landscape and waited for Neanderthal psychology to collapse under the weight of impossible desire. Isotope analysis from teeth at multiple sites shows Neanderthal dietary patterns changed dramatically during the contact period. They started following megafauna migrations they'd previously ignored, long-distance tracking behavior that made no ecological sense unless they were following sapiens groups at a distance, stalking without approaching. The final populations show signs of behavioral modernity they'd never displayed before. Symbolic thinking, abstract art, jewelry, and body modification. They were desperately trying to become the kind of humans that sapiens women might accept. Evolution in real time driven by sexual selection pressure. At Arcy-sur-Cure in France, the youngest Neanderthal layers contain sapien-style cave paintings, not crude imitations but sophisticated reproductions. They'd learned to think like their replacements in their final generations. Too late to save themselves, but enough to prove they understood what they'd lost. Recent DNA analysis from Max Planck Institute shows the final twist. The last Neanderthal sapiens breeding happened 28,000 years ago, exactly when the last pure Neanderthal populations vanished from the fossil record. They didn't go extinct from competition or climate change. They bred themselves out of existence, chose genetic absorption over genetic isolation. The beautiful women won without fighting, without planning, without even knowing they were in a war. They simply walked into Europe and waited for Neanderthal men to destroy themselves with wanting what they couldn't understand. Evolution's cruelest victory was making survival look like love. The metabolic cost of chronic arousal was devastating. Neanderthal males at Kibara Cave in Israel show bone density loss consistent with prolonged malnutrition, not from lack of food, but from inability to digest it properly. Stress hormones had shut down their digestive systems. They were starving in the presence of abundance because their bodies couldn't process nutrients while flooded with attraction chemicals. Dental wear patterns from Tabun Cave reveal another dimension of the crisis. Neanderthal teeth from the contact period show excessive grinding and clenching. Sleep bruxism caused by anxiety dreams. They were literally grinding their teeth down to the roots thinking about sapiens women. Some skulls show complete dental destruction, unable to eat, unable to hunt, waiting to die. The social breakdown was equally catastrophic. At Moulagersi Cave in France, researchers found evidence of unprecedented violence within Neanderthal groups. Cut marks on bones suggest cannibalism driven not by hunger, but by rage. Males turning on each other when denied access to foreign females. The cooperative bonds that had sustained them for millennia dissolved in a generation. Trace element analysis from Neanderthal hair samples preserved in permafrost shows elevated mercury levels during the contact period. Not from environmental contamination, but from consuming raw fish in impossible quantities. They were abandoning their traditional diet, gorging on anything that might increase their attractiveness to sapiens women. Desperate nutritional experiments that poisoned them slowly. The migration patterns tell their own story. Neanderthal settlements shift dramatically after 40,000 years ago. Instead of following seasonal game migrations, they start tracking human movement corridors. At Kostenki in Russia, Neanderthal tools appear in layers where they'd never been found before. They were following sapiens groups across impossible distances, abandoning territories their ancestors had held for millennia. Pollen analysis from sediment cores reveals the ecological impact. Neanderthal hunting grounds recover rapidly after abandonment. Mammoth populations explode. Cave bear numbers surge. The ecosystem rebounds as if a major predator had vanished overnight. But the Neanderthals weren't dead. They were elsewhere, paralyzed by obsession. The acoustic evidence is haunting. At Divya Babe Cave in Slovenia, researchers found Neanderthal flutes dated to 39,000 years ago. Bone instruments capable of producing sapiens-like vocal frequencies. They were learning to make sounds that might attract the women who terrified them. Music as a mating display they'd never needed before contact. Blood chemistry reconstruction from bone collagen shows another disturbing pattern. Neanderthal testosterone levels crash during the contact period, while cortisol soars. The classic hormonal profile of chronic depression combined with severe anxiety. Their bodies were shutting down masculine aggression while ramping up stress responses. They were becoming neurochemically incapable of defending their territory. At Cueva Anton in Spain, archaeologists discovered Neanderthal cosmetics, ochre pigments and manganese powders arranged in patterns that match sapiens' body painting traditions. They were decorating themselves using foreign techniques, trying to become visually appealing to women, whose aesthetic preferences they could only guess at. Cultural mimicry born of desperation. The chronological precision is devastating. Radiocarbon dates from 12 different sites show Neanderthal population collapse beginning within 500 years of first sapiens contact. Not gradual decline, but precipitous demographic crash. At La Ferocious in France, occupation layers go from rich artifact deposits to empty cave floors in less than 3 generations. Parasite analysis from Neanderthal coprolites reveals compromised immune function during the contact period. Intestinal worm loads increased dramatically. Bacterial infections that their ancestors had easily resisted become fatal. Chronic stress had destroyed their disease resistance. They were dying from infections that should have been minor inconveniences. The genetic bottleneck was extreme. DNA analysis from late Neanderthal populations shows effective breeding size dropping below 50 individuals across entire regions. At that threshold, any species faces immediate extinction risk, but they weren't dying from inbreeding depression. They were dying from refusing to breed with their own kind while being unable to successfully breed with others. Lithic analysis reveals cognitive decline in real time. Neanderthal stone tools from the final period show decreased complexity and increased production errors. Knapping techniques that had been refined over thousands of generations suddenly become crude and inefficient. Their hands still worked, but their minds were elsewhere, thinking about women they couldn't have. The cave art at Cueva de Ardales in Spain shows the final psychological breakdown. Abstract symbols that match no known Neanderthal artistic tradition. Researchers now believe they represent failed attempts to communicate with sapiens using visual language they'd observed but didn't understand. Desperate messages to women who would never see them. Biomechanical analysis of late Neanderthal skeletons shows decreased muscle mass and bone density, not from aging or disease, but from reduced physical activity. They'd stopped hunting, stopped traveling, stopped doing the activities that had built their powerful physiques. Wasting away while dreaming of genetic integration they could never achieve. The temperature records from ice cores reveal the final irony. The contact period coincides with a brief warming trend that should have favored Neanderthal survival. Climate wasn't the killer. The environment was improving just as their psychology collapsed. They had everything they needed to thrive, except the ability to ignore the beautiful women who had invaded their world. At Cueva del Boquete de Zafaraya in Spain, the last known pure Neanderthal site, excavations revealed hoarded obsidian blades never used for any practical purpose. Analysis shows the volcanic glass came from sources 500 kilometers away in central Italy. They'd traveled impossible distances to collect stones that match the tools used by sapiens women, fetish objects that cost them everything to obtain. The final DNA evidence came from an unexpected source. In 2023, researchers analyzing ancient DNA from Bachokiro Cave in Bulgaria found something that reframes everything. Neanderthal Y chromosome markers that persist for 3,000 years after the supposed extinction. The males didn't all die out. Some succeeded in their desperate gamble. Their sons carried forward the genetic memory of fathers who chose desire over tribal loyalty. But soil samples from the cave floors tell the darker truth. Phosphate levels consistent with mass decomposition occur precisely when the genetic mixing peaks. The successful breeding events happened among populations already in demographic collapse. The beautiful women didn't just conquer hearts, they conquered the future itself, ensuring that even victory meant extinction. The fear was justified. In the end, the most dangerous predator wasn't the one with teeth and claws. It was the one with a smile they couldn't resist and genes they couldn't survive wanting.